Ignored by millions, that's how it all began. In the glittering world of billionaires, where cameras flash and crowds cheer, one little girl stood in silence. She was the daughter of a man who owned skyscrapers that touched the clouds, airlines that crossed oceans, and islands that sparkled like jewels in the sea. Her father's name was on the covers of magazines, whispered in meetings of power, and envied by men who had less. He was the symbol of success, of money, of everything the world seemed to worship. And yet, beside him, in every photograph, in every public appearance, stood a little figure almost always blurred by indifference. Her dresses were stitched by Parisian designers whose names others could barely pronounce. Her tiny shoes were custom-made in Italy. At birthdays, she received dolls that cost more than cars and toys made of gold and diamonds. She lived in a palace of glass and gold, a home so vast it had hallways like tunnels, staircases that seemed endless, and gardens filled with fountains that sang without voices. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. But inside, she was invisible. Not because she was shy. Not because she was unworthy. But because she could not hear, and she could not speak. The world called her the mute princess. At every gala, when her father stood on the stage giving grand speeches, people applauded and cheered. But when his daughter appeared at his side, silence fell, not the respectful kind, but the kind filled with discomfort. Eyes slid past her. Smiles faltered. A few people even whispered, "Poor thing." Some pitied her, others ignored her, but none truly saw her. A billionaire's daughter who could not talk. For them, she was not a miracle but a tragedy. And tragedies, in their world, were best left unspoken. The girl, though young, noticed. Of course she noticed. Children always do. She saw the way people turned away. She felt the way conversations stopped when she drew near. She read the pity in their eyes. She didn't need ears to hear the rejection, and she didn't need words to understand that she was unwanted. So she began to fold herself inward. At her father's glittering parties, where chandeliers sparkled and laughter echoed, she sat in corners, quiet and small, hands neatly folded in her lap. Other children ran across marble floors, chasing balloons, shrieking in joy, their laughter bouncing against the golden walls. She watched them from a distance, her lips trembling as if she wanted to join but couldn't find the door to their world. When music filled the ballroom, violins, drums, singers with voices like silk, she saw the performers move, saw mouths open wide, saw people clap in rhythm. But to her, it was all silence. A dazzling show that never reached her heart. She smiled sometimes, pretending to understand, but inside she was lost in emptiness. Her days were long, wrapped in quiet. Tutors tried to teach her lip reading, but she could only catch fragments. Doctors strapped machines to her ears, promising she'd hear, but all she got was static and confusion. The adults around her were always frustrated, always sighing, always telling her to try harder. But how could she try to chase something she never knew? In the grand mansion's garden, birds sang in the morning. She saw them flap their wings and open their beaks, but to her, they were only shapes in the air. She saw raindrops fall against glass windows and imagined their sound. She pressed her ear to her father's chest when he hugged her, feeling the rumble of his voice but never the words. She longed to know what it felt like to truly hear. And when she saw her father's lips moving, giving orders, laughing with friends, whispering to important men, she wished she could answer. She wished she could say just one word, "Papa." But her lips stayed frozen, her throat silent. People thought she was broken. But she wasn't. She had thoughts, feelings, dreams swirling inside her like storms trapped behind glass. She wanted to laugh with the other children. She wanted to ask her father questions. She wanted to sing. But no one gave her the chance to show that she was more than her silence. Her birthdays were the hardest. The house would be filled with balloons and cakes taller than she was. Gifts piled up like mountains. Cameras flashed. Guests clapped politely. But in the middle of it all, the little girl sat with her hands on her lap, watching the candles flicker. She couldn't blow them out with a wish, and even if she could, she had no voice to whisper it. Every birthday was the same, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet completely alone. Ignored by millions. That was her life. And though she lived in the richest palace, she felt poorer than anyone else. Her father tried to hide the pain, standing tall with pride at galas and charity balls. He was a man who had faced competitors, lawsuits, and crises that would crush ordinary people, and he always walked away stronger. But when it came to his daughter, he was powerless. Behind the doors of his golden mansion, where no cameras could see, he often sat in the dark, his head in his hands, weeping quietly. For all his power, for all his wealth, he could not give her the one thing she wanted most, a voice. He wished he could trade his skyscrapers for her laughter. He wished he could give away his fleets of planes if only she could call him Papa. Every night, he tucked her into bed, smiling bravely, but when he turned away, his chest ached with grief. He prayed in silence to gods he wasn't even sure he believed in. He prayed for ears that could hear, for a voice that could sing, for words that could express the ocean inside her heart. Doctors came and went like seasons. Some arrived with machines the size of suitcases, wires and blinking lights, promising that they could restore her hearing. Others spoke of surgeries that cost millions, treatments still untested, procedures that gave more hope than results. The father signed every check, desperate for a miracle. He flew her across the world to famous hospitals, begging experts to help. They nodded politely, examined her, wrote notes on their charts. And then, one by one, they left him with the same answer: there is no cure. Each disappointment cut deeper than the last. The father would return home, holding her hand as if it might slip away. He would tell her stories with his lips, even though he knew she couldn't hear them, hoping she would read his smile, if not his words. And she always did. She gazed at him with wide, trusting eyes, as if she understood without hearing. But that only made his pain heavier, because she accepted her silence better than he did. And so, the girl grew up surrounded by noise she could never understand. At business dinners, she sat at the grand table as voices rose and fell around her like waves crashing on a shore. She saw mouths moving, laughter spilling out, glasses clinking together in toasts. But to her, it was like watching a movie with no sound. Her father squeezed her hand beneath the table, but she could feel how tense he was, how much he wished she could belong. At charity balls, dancers twirled beneath chandeliers, violins played, singers filled the hall with soaring voices. She watched their mouths, trying to imagine the beauty of their sound. Sometimes she tapped her fingers against the table, mimicking the rhythm of their movement. But it wasn't the same. It was like reaching for a rainbow you could never touch. Even in school, where her father insisted she be treated like every other child, she was isolated. The teachers spoke, and the other children laughed, whispered, and played. She sat alone at her desk, copying letters onto paper without knowing how they sounded. When classmates talked to her, she stared blankly, not understanding. Some grew frustrated. Others mocked her behind her back. A few simply ignored her, treating her as though she were invisible. Every day was a reminder that she lived in a world built for voices, not silence. And yet, she was not weak. Though she could not speak, her eyes told stories. Though she could not hear, her smile carried warmth. She loved to draw in her notebooks, creating worlds where she was free to sing and dance. Sometimes, she would sit by the garden fountain, sketching pictures of herself surrounded by people who understood her, who saw her not as the mute princess, but as simply herself. Her father often found her there, sitting cross-legged on the marble steps, her hands stained with pencil. He would stand quietly behind her, watching her create. The drawings broke his heart, because they were filled with dreams he couldn't give her. He wanted to protect her from every cruel whisper, every dismissive glance, every pitying smile. But he couldn't. No amount of guards, money, or power could shield her from the loneliness of being misunderstood. And so, little by little, he built walls. Not around his mansion, those were already there, but around his daughter. He stopped taking her to public events. He declined invitations to parties. He limited her outings to places where people wouldn't stare. He thought he was protecting her, but in reality, he was hiding her away. The girl noticed. She always noticed. She would sit by her bedroom window at night, watching the city lights in the distance, wondering why she was always left behind. She pressed her palm against the glass, as if she could reach through it and touch the laughter she saw in the world outside. Ignored by millions. Shielded by her father's fear. Surrounded by noise she could never touch. This was her life. And though she carried her silence with grace, inside she longed for just one thing, someone who would truly see her, not with ears, not with pity, but with understanding. It happened on a day that was meant to be nothing more than a publicity event. The billionaire had funded a magnificent fountain in the city square, a towering display of crystal water shooting into the sky, surrounded by marble benches and gardens. The mayor was there, the cameras were there, and so were crowds of ordinary people who wanted a glimpse of wealth and power. The billionaire's daughter sat quietly beside him on a polished stone bench, dressed in a white gown with tiny pearls embroidered across the sleeves. She looked like a porcelain doll, elegant but distant. The crowd didn't notice her. They noticed the fountain, the father, the flashing bulbs. As always, she was a shadow in the background. Until a figure emerged. Through the buzzing crowd, a small girl walked forward. She was no older than 10, with braided hair tied neatly with worn ribbons. Her dress was faded, her shoes scuffed. Unlike the polished men and women in gowns and tuxedos, this girl belonged to another world, the world outside of wealth and gold. Yet, she carried herself with courage, each step certain, each movement unafraid. The guards reacted instantly. They moved to block her, their voices sharp, their hands reaching. But the girl ducked through them like water slipping through fingers, determined to reach the billionaire's daughter. Gasps rose from the audience. Who was she? Where were her parents? How dare she step so boldly toward the richest family in the city? But she didn't stop. She stood in front of the billionaire's daughter, who blinked in confusion, unsure of what was happening. And then, something extraordinary occurred. The little black girl lifted her hands and began to move them. Not wildly, not randomly, but in a rhythm, in shapes, in a silent dance of meaning. She was signing. The billionaire's daughter froze. Her wide eyes locked onto the girl's fingers, following every motion, every curve of her hand, every flick of her wrist. At first, her lips trembled, as though afraid to hope. But then, something inside her broke open. Her hands rose, slowly, hesitantly, and she answered. A cry of astonishment swept through the square. People leaned forward, their whispers cutting through the air like knives. She's responding. She understands. What's happening? For the first time in her life, the billionaire's daughter was not ignored. All eyes were on her, but not with pity. With wonder. Her small hands moved faster now, answering with excitement. Her face lit up like a lantern, joy radiating from her silent laughter. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not the tears of loneliness she had shed so many nights before. These were tears of recognition. The two girls, one wrapped in pearls, the other in ribbons, spoke fluently in a language no one else around them understood. To the crowd, it looked like magic. To the father, it looked like a miracle. He stumbled to his feet, his chest tightening as he watched his daughter's silence transform into a voice, not of sound, but of hands. His lips parted, but no words came. For years he had begged for her to speak, and now here she was, speaking without sound, speaking in a way he had never thought possible. The little black girl glanced at him briefly, then turned back to his daughter, signing with patience and warmth. Later, an interpreter in the crowd would explain what she had said, "You're not alone. I understand you." The billionaire's daughter answered with trembling fingers, "You see me?" And the girl smiled, her hands forming the words, "Yes. I see you." In that moment, everything shifted. The crowd, once indifferent, leaned closer. Reporters lifted their cameras, not to capture the billionaire or his fortune, but to capture the silent conversation between two children. The mayor himself lowered his head, stunned. And somewhere in that sea of people, hearts cracked open, realizing the depth of what they were witnessing. A princess of wealth, invisible in her silence. A child of poverty, carrying the gift of understanding. Two worlds colliding, not in conflict, but in connection. The billionaire pressed his hands against his mouth, his eyes glistening. All the wealth in the world, all the doctors and machines, had failed to give his daughter what this little girl had given in a single moment, a voice. And for the first time in her life, his daughter was not ignored. She was seen. She was heard, even without sound. The fountain sprayed behind them, water sparkling in the sunlight, as if celebrating the miracle unfolding before it. But no one looked at the fountain anymore. No one looked at the father or the polished stage. All eyes were on the two little girls whose hands spoke louder than any microphone. The billionaire's daughter froze. Her wide eyes locked onto the girl's fingers, following every motion, every curve of her hand, every flick of her wrist. At first, her lips trembled, as though afraid to hope. But then, something inside her broke open. Her hands rose, slowly, hesitantly, and she answered. A cry of astonishment swept through the square. People leaned forward, their whispers cutting through the air like knives. She's responding. She understands. What's happening? For the first time in her life, the billionaire's daughter was not ignored. All eyes were on her, but not with pity. With wonder. Her small hands moved faster now, answering with excitement. Her face lit up like a lantern, joy radiating from her silent laughter. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not the tears of loneliness she had shed so many nights before. These were tears of recognition. The two girls, one wrapped in pearls, the other in ribbons, spoke fluently in a language no one else around them understood. To the crowd, it looked like magic. To the father, it looked like a miracle. He stumbled to his feet, his chest tightening as he watched his daughter's silence transform into a voice, not of sound, but of hands. His lips parted, but no words came. For years he had begged for her to speak, and now here she was, speaking without sound, speaking in a way he had never thought possible. The little black girl glanced at him briefly, then turned back to his daughter, signing with patience and warmth. Later, an interpreter in the crowd would explain what she had said, "You're not alone. I understand you." The billionaire's daughter answered with trembling fingers, "You see me?" And the girl smiled, her hands forming the words, "Yes. I see you." In that moment, everything shifted. The crowd, once indifferent, leaned closer. Reporters lifted their cameras, not to capture the billionaire or his fortune, but to capture the silent conversation between two children. The mayor himself lowered his head, stunned. And somewhere in that sea of people, hearts cracked open, realizing the depth of what they were witnessing. A princess of wealth, invisible in her silence. A child of poverty, carrying the gift of understanding. Two worlds colliding, not in conflict, but in connection. The billionaire pressed his hands against his mouth, his eyes glistening. All the wealth in the world, all the doctors and machines, had failed to give his daughter what this little girl had given in a single moment, a voice. And for the first time in her life, his daughter was not ignored. She was seen. She was heard, even without sound. The fountain sprayed behind them, water sparkling in the sunlight, as if celebrating the miracle unfolding before it. But no one looked at the fountain anymore. No one looked at the father or the polished stage. All eyes were on the two little girls whose hands spoke louder than any microphone. The billionaire's daughter had been ignored by millions. But that day, she was finally understood, by one. And that was enough to change everything. For a long moment after the two girls signed to each other, the square stood in absolute silence. It was as if the fountain itself had stopped mid-splash, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, almost at once, the spell broke. People gasped. Reporters shouted. Cameras clicked so fast that the flashes looked like lightning. The crowd that had once ignored the billionaire's daughter now leaned forward, straining to capture every second of her silent conversation. They weren't looking at her father. They weren't admiring the fountain. They were watching her. For the first time in her life, she was the center of attention, not because of pity, but because of wonder. The billionaire's hands shook as he reached for his daughter, kneeling down beside her. Tears streaked down his cheeks, his polished public image cracking into something raw and human. He whispered her name, though he knew she couldn't hear it. Still, she turned to him, and in quick, clumsy motions, she signed the words she had just learned, Papa. I love you. The father broke. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her into his chest as if he could shield her from every cruel whisper, every empty stare she had endured. His sobs were loud, messy, unrestrained, the kind of sound no one had ever imagined coming from the man the world saw as unshakable. The little black girl stood quietly nearby, watching with soft eyes. When the father finally looked up, his gaze locked on her. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but words felt too small. His lips trembled as he mouthed, "Thank you," again and again, as if repeating it would somehow measure up to the miracle she had brought. But she simply smiled, lifted her hands, and signed slowly, she was never broken. She only needed someone to listen. The billionaire's throat tightened. That one sentence hit harder than any truth he had ever heard in a boardroom. His daughter wasn't incomplete. She wasn't less. She had been whole all along. The world had failed her, not the other way around. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Clips of the moment flooded every screen, on phones, on news channels, on social media feeds. The video was watched millions of times in hours. Headlines screamed across the world. The silent princess speaks through hands. Billionaire's daughter breaks years of silence in miraculous moment. One child's gift of language changes everything. For years, people had ignored her existence, brushing past her as if she were invisible. But now? Now they couldn't look away. Her face, once hidden in the background of her father's photos, was everywhere, on magazine covers, on billboards, on television screens. But more than that, her story was opening hearts. Families with deaf children saw her as a symbol of hope. Schools scrambled to introduce sign language programs. Parents who had never thought of teaching their children how to sign suddenly began learning, realizing that communication was more than just sound. Around the world, voices rose, not with pity, but with respect. And through it all, the little black girl remained by her side. Reporters swarmed, trying to uncover who she was, where she came from. They learned her brother was deaf, that she had taught herself sign language just to make sure he would never feel alone. That act of love had now changed another child's life, and inspired millions more. The billionaire, once known only for his wealth and power, changed too. His empire no longer felt like enough. For years, he had poured his fortune into skyscrapers and airlines. Now, he poured it into something else: schools for the deaf, programs to teach sign language in every city, research into better tools for communication. He stood before cameras, not as the polished tycoon people admired, but as a father who had been humbled. "I spent billions trying to fix my daughter," he admitted, his voice breaking. But she was never broken. She only needed the world to understand her. Those words echoed across nations. And through it all, his daughter stood taller, no longer hiding in the corners of rooms, no longer folding herself small. She signed boldly in front of cameras, her smile brighter than diamonds, her joy louder than any orchestra. The world that once ignored her was now listening. Truly listening. But in her heart, she knew the truth. It wasn't the cameras, or the headlines, or even her father's billions that gave her this gift. It was one girl, one small, brave girl in a faded dress with braids and ribbons, who had seen her when no one else did. Two children, from worlds apart, had come together in a single moment of recognition. And that moment had changed everything. From that day forward, life was never the same. The billionaire's mansion, once filled with quiet sorrow, now echoed with something new, laughter without sound. The daughter, once hidden away, now spent her days in the garden, her hands dancing as she spoke to her new friend. The little black girl visited often, and together they filled the air with a language no one else in the house had ever seen before. To others, their hands moved like fluttering birds, fast and graceful. To them, it was music, music the world could not hear, but they felt in their bones. The two girls became inseparable. They walked side by side through the marble halls, shared meals at the long golden table, and sat for hours in the library, giggling silently as they signed stories to each other. One came from wealth, the other from struggle. One lived in a palace, the other in a modest home. But in each other, they found something far greater than riches or status. They found someone who truly understood. The billionaire watched in awe. He had spent years believing his daughter was trapped in silence, only to realize she had been waiting for someone who could speak her language. And so, he made sure that gift spread. Sign language teachers were hired for the entire household. The maids learned, the chefs learned, the security guards learned. Soon, the mansion itself seemed alive with hands moving in conversation. For the first time, his daughter was not a stranger in her own home. But the change didn't stop there. Schools around the city began offering free sign language classes. Families gathered in community centers, learning together, eager to open a door to communication they had never considered before. Children who once ignored their deaf classmates now waved their hands with pride, discovering a new way to say hello. The billionaire used his influence to build something far greater than skyscrapers. He built bridges of understanding. Foundations were launched, scholarships created, hospitals funded. He poured his billions not into gold, but into giving a voice to those the world had left in silence. He often said, "My daughter was not healed by doctors. She was healed by kindness. Let the world learn from that." And the world did. The daughter, once known as the mute princess, was no longer defined by what she lacked. She was admired for what she gave: hope, courage, and proof that silence was not weakness. She appeared on stages, not to speak into microphones, but to sign her story. Audiences watched in awe as interpreters shared her words aloud, while her hands moved with grace and power. She taught people that communication was more than sound, that voices could be heard through love, through patience, through hands that moved with meaning. And always, standing beside her, was the little black girl who had seen her when no one else did. They weren't sisters by blood, but by choice. The daughter called her the sister of my soul. Together, they showed the world that connection didn't need wealth, or fame, or even words. It only needed empathy. One evening, years later, the two of them sat by the same fountain where their story had begun. The water sparkled in the evening sun, just as it had that first day. They sat with their hands moving in the rhythm of their secret language, laughing silently as the world bustled around them. The billionaire stood at a distance, watching. His heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that a miracle had entered his daughter's life not through money, not through science, but through the courage of a child who refused to let another remain unseen. The fountain gushed behind them, the city lights flickered on, and somewhere in the distance, music played. The billionaire's daughter could not hear it. She never would. But she didn't need to. Her music was already alive in the language of her hands, and in the love of the friend who had given her voice to her silence. And so, her story became more than a headline. More than a viral video. It became a lesson carried across generations. That silence is not emptiness. That a voice is not only sound. And that sometimes, the loudest conversations happen without a single word spoken. Ignored by millions, until she was seen by one. And that one changed everything.